I was weeks away from marrying Emily Carter, and that still feels unreal to say. Do you know how lucky we are? I told her that night, sitting on the edge of the bed. She laughed and said, "You say that every day." I smiled and replied, "Because I mean it every day." We argued lightly about wedding flowers, about my mother inviting too many relatives, about money. "We'll figure it out," she said, touching my hand. "We always do." I believed her without doubt. Before sleeping, she whispered, "Promise me nothing will change us." I said nothing could. She turned off the light, and that was the last normal moment of my life. When I woke up, the bed was cold. I called out, "Emily?" No answer. I checked the bathroom. Empty. The closet door was open. Half her clothes were gone. My chest tightened as I grabbed my phone and dialed her number. "The number you have dialed is switched off." I said, "No, no, no," out loud like my voice could fix it. I called again. Same message. I texted, "Where are you? Please call me." No reply. I walked into the kitchen and saw her mug missing. My hand started shaking. "This isn't funny," I said to the empty room. I sat on the couch and tried to breathe. After 10 minutes, I called her best friend. "Sophia, have you seen Emily?" Silence, then "No, what?" I said, "She's gone. Her things are gone." Sophia paused and said, "Maybe she needed space." I replied, "She wouldn't leave without a word." She said softly, "I have to go," and hung up. I drove to her parents' house. Her mother opened the door and looked surprised. "Why are you here so early?" she asked. I said, "Emily didn't come home." Her father stepped in and said, "She's an adult." I said, "She's my fiancée." Her mother avoided my eyes. "She didn't tell us anything," she said. I asked, "Are you lying to me?" Her father said sharply, "You should leave." I stood there, stunned, and said, "If you hear from her, tell her I'm scared." No one answered. Outside, I called Daniel Brooks, my best friend since childhood. "Bro, something's wrong," I said. He answered, "Calm down." "What happened?" I said, "Emily's gone." He paused, then said, "I'll come over." When he arrived, he hugged me and said, "We'll find her." I asked, "Why does everyone sound so calm?" He avoided my eyes and said, "Maybe she panicked." I said, "She loves me." He nodded too fast. We searched the apartment again. I asked, "Did she say anything strange lately?" Daniel said, "No, man." I watched his hand shake. "Look at me," I said. He did briefly. Something felt wrong. "You tell me if you knew something," I said. He replied, "Of course." His voice cracked. I asked, "Did I do something?" He said, "No," I whispered. "Then why does this feel like a goodbye?" That night, Daniel left. I stood alone in our bedroom, holding her pillow. I said, "Emily, come back." My phone stayed silent. The apartment felt empty, like she had erased herself. I realized she didn't just leave the house. She left my life. Days passed, then weeks, and every morning I said her name like a prayer. "Emily, please call me," I whispered to my phone. The screen stayed dark. I texted, "I'm worried. Just say you're okay." No reply. I called her parents again, straight to voicemail. "I know you see my calls," I said aloud, pacing my room. "I'm not a stranger." Well, I tried Sophia again. My message showed seen and nothing else. That hurt more than being blocked. At night, I replayed everything. Did I miss something? I asked myself. Did I say the wrong thing? I remembered her smile, her silence, the way she turned away that last night. "You're overthinking," I told myself. Then I answered myself, "Or you were blind." I barely slept. When I did, I dreamed she stood in front of me, close enough to touch, but silent. Daniel stayed around a lot. "You need to eat," he said, handing me food. I asked, "Why won't anyone talk to me?" He shrugged and said, "People handle things weirdly." I stared at him and asked, "You really think this is normal?" He looked away and said, "I'm just trying to help." His voice sounded tight. I noticed how fast he changed the subject. "Did she ever say she was unhappy?" I asked. He replied too quickly. "No," I said. "You didn't even think about it." One afternoon, Sophia finally agreed to meet. She texted, "Don't tell anyone." We sat in a quiet cafe. I said, "Thank you for coming." She didn't smile. I asked, "Where is she?" She took a breath and said, "You need to stop looking." I laughed once and said, "That's your advice?" She leaned forward and whispered, "For your own good." My chest tightened. "Why would you say that?" I asked. She said, because this will only hurt you more. I asked, what will? She shook her head. I can't say. I felt my hands tremble. Did I hurt her? I asked. She looked down and said, this isn't about blame. I said, then what is it about? She stood up and said, please, let it go. I whispered, I love her. She paused and said softly, that's why I'm warning you. Then she walked away. I sat there, staring at the empty chair, feeling smaller than ever. That night, I confronted Daniel. Sophia told me to stop looking, I said. He froze for half a second. Why would she say that? He asked. I replied, you tell me. He sighed and said, people are scared of drama. I said, or scared of the truth. He rubbed his face and said, you're exhausted. I stepped closer and asked, are you hiding something? He met my eyes for a moment, then looked away. No, he said too softly. I started questioning myself. What kind of man gets abandoned like this? I asked my reflection, was I not enough? I stopped going to work regularly. I stopped answering calls. My world became small and loud at the same time. Every silence felt heavy. Every glance from Daniel felt wrong. One night I said, if you know something, tell me. He replied, I swear I don't. His voice shook. That was when I realized the silence wasn't empty. Someone was filling it with lies, and that someone was close. I woke up that morning and said, maybe today she'll call. I opened my phone without hope, just habit. I scrolled once, then again. Then I saw her face. Emily, smiling, glowing, pregnant. I whispered, no, and kept staring. My fingers started shaking as I read the caption. A new chapter begins. I scrolled down and saw the tag. Daniel Brooks. I dropped the phone and said, this isn't real. My chest felt tight, like something heavy was sitting on it. I picked the phone back up. Comments flooded the screen. So happy for you both. You'll be amazing parents. Her mother wrote, my beautiful daughter. I laughed once, sharp and broken, and said, I was supposed to be there. My vision blurred. My ears rang. I heard my own voice saying, he's my best friend. I scrolled through more photos. Him touching her stomach. Him smiling like he won something. I whispered, how long? But the screen didn't answer. I called Daniel immediately. He didn't answer. I called again. Pick up, I said through my teeth. He finally answered and said, hey. I replied, don't say my name. He went quiet. I said I saw the post. He exhaled slowly and said, we should talk. I replied, you think. I drove to his place without thinking. My hands were numb on the steering wheel. I kept saying, breathe, like that would stop my heart from breaking. When he opened the door, I said, how long? He looked tired. Come in, he said. I stayed standing. Answer me, I said. He rubbed his face and said, it just happened. I laughed and said, pregnancy doesn't just happen. He flinched. Emily chose me, he said. I stepped back and asked, after sleeping in my bed? He whispered, I didn't plan this. I said, you planned every lie. He said, I didn't want to hurt you. I replied, you destroyed me. He tried to explain. She was confused, he said. You were distant. I interrupted. So you replaced me? He said, I love her. I stared at him and said, you loved me too. He couldn't look at me. I asked, did you ever plan to tell me? He shook his head. That hurt more than his words. I waited for anger to explode. It didn't. I felt empty instead. I trusted you, I said quietly. He said, I know. I replied, you knew what you were doing. He said, I didn't think it would go this far. I nodded slowly. That's what betrayal sounds like, I said. He reached out and said my name. I stepped back. Don't, I said. You don't get to touch me. I walked out without another word. Outside, I sat in my car and stared at nothing. I said, something inside me just died. I went home and opened my phone again. I deleted photos. One by one. Our smiles. Our plans. I whispered, you chose him. My hand stopped shaking. I realized revenge didn't start with fists. It started with silence. It started with control. I put the phone down and said, I will survive. I left the city without telling anyone. I packed one suitcase and said, this place is killing me. No one argued. The new city felt quiet and anonymous. On my first day at work, a man looked at my resume and said, you're late to your own life. I replied, I know. He smirked and said, Name's Mark Reynolds. I shook his hand and said, I won't waste your time. He said, good. Don't waste mine either. Mark watched everything. You work like you're running, he said one night. I replied, I am. He said, from what? I stayed silent. He leaned back and said, you blaming yourself? I nodded. Stop, he said. Blame doesn't pay rent. I laughed weakly. Nothing feels real, I admitted. He said, then build something real. His words stayed with me. I stopped checking Emily's social media. When my hand reached for my phone, I said, not today. Some nights I failed. I'd say just once, then close the app before it loaded. I talked to myself more than anyone. You trusted too easily, I said. You disappeared inside her. The truth hurt, but it felt clean. At work, Mark pushed me harder. You want respect? He asked. Earn it. I stayed late. I learned faster. I stopped making excuses. I started therapy after Mark said, you don't heal by pretending you're fine. In the first session, I said, I don't know who I am alone. The therapist asked, do you want to learn? I said, yes. I talked about my fear of being abandoned. I said, I made her my whole world. Saying it out loud felt heavy. I walked out and said, that ends now. Healing wasn't loud. It was slow and uncomfortable. Mark noticed the change. You standing straighter, he said. I replied, I stopped begging life to like me. He nodded. Good. We talk late some nights. He said, pain sharpens you if you let it. I asked, what if it breaks you? He said, then you rebuild better. I believed him. I still dreamed of Emily sometimes. I'd wake up and say, you're not here. Then I'd get dressed and move forward anyway. Weeks passed. My body felt stronger. My mind felt quieter. I didn't forgive Emily or Daniel. I told myself, forgiveness is not required for growth. I didn't forget either. I used the memory as fuel. Mark called me into his office one evening. Sit, he said. I did. He looked at me and said, you earned this. He slid a paper across the desk. Promotion. I stared at it and said, you're serious? He replied, I don't joke about work. I walked outside after that and breathed deeply. This is mine, I said. No applause. No revenge. Just progress. For the first time since everything broke, I felt steady. I whispered, I'm still standing. Months passed, and I stopped counting the days. One evening at work, someone said, did you hear about Daniel Brooks? I froze but kept my voice calm. No, I said. The guy shrugged. Lost his job. Big mess. I nodded once and went back to my screen. Inside, something shifted. Not joy. Not anger. Just confirmation. Later, another voice said, Emily's not doing well either. I asked, how do you know? They replied, people talk. I said nothing more. I didn't ask questions. I didn't dig. I told myself, watching is not the same as interfering. At home, I sat with the silence and realized it no longer scared me. My phone stayed quiet, and for once that felt peaceful. At work, Laura Bennett started sitting across from me during breaks. You always eat alone, she said. I replied, I like the quiet. She smiled and said, quiet doesn't have to mean lonely. I didn't argue. Laura talked easily. You ever think about starting over? She asked one day. I said every day. She nodded. Me too. There was no pressure in her voice. No expectations. When she laughed, it didn't feel sharp. One afternoon, she said, you okay today? I answered honestly. Yeah, for once. She said, good. You deserve calm. That sentence stayed with me longer than she knew. A mutual acquaintance called me that weekend. Man, things are rough for them, he said. I asked, why are you telling me? He hesitated. Thought you'd like to know. I replied, I don't need updates. He laughed awkwardly. Guess karma's real. I said, karma doesn't need witnesses. I hung up and felt lighter. Revenge suddenly felt small compared to peace. Laura noticed my mood. You look different, she said. I asked, better or worse? She replied, clearer. We walked together after work. She said, I like how you listen. I answered, I spent a long time not being heard. She didn't ask for details. That made me trust her more. Trust felt risky, but this time it didn't feel desperate. Late one night, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered and heard Daniel's voice, slurred. You happy now? He asked. I stayed silent. He laughed bitterly. She cries all the time. I lost everything. I said, You should talk to someone else. He snapped. You think you're better than me? I replied calmly. I think I'm done. He shouted. This is your fault. I said no. This is your choice. He started ranting. I gave up everything for her. I interrupted. You took everything from me. Silence followed. Then he said, say something. I answered goodbye. I ended the call and set the phone down. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't racing. I realized then that karma had already done its work. The next day, Laura handed me coffee and said, rough night? I smiled slightly. No, I said, just a closing chapter. She said, I'm glad you're here. I replied, me too. I didn't celebrate their pain. I didn't feel proud. I felt dignified. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Her message arrived on a quiet evening. Can we talk? It said. I stared at the screen and laughed once. Now you want to talk? I whispered. The message kept going. She wrote about regret, fear, and feeling lost. She wrote my name like it still belonged to her. I typed, what do you want? She replied, to explain. I waited, then typed one meeting. That's all. She answered, thank you. I said out loud, this is for me. We met in a small cafe. She stood when she saw me and said, you look different. I replied, you do too. She sat slowly and said, I didn't know if you'd come. I said, I didn't know if I should. She nodded. I deserve that. I stayed quiet. She took a breath and said, I'm sorry. I didn't respond. Silence stretched. She said, say something. I replied, I'm listening. She looked down and said, I chose comfort over loyalty. I raised an eyebrow, but stayed silent. She continued, Daniel made things easy. You made things real. I asked, and real scared you? She nodded. I thought love was supposed to feel safe. I said, love is supposed to feel honest. Her eyes filled. I know that now, she whispered. I said nothing. I didn't need to win. I just needed truth. She reached for her cup and said, I feel trapped. I asked by who. She hesitated. By my choices. I nodded. That sounds right. She looked at me and said, I miss you. I replied, you miss how I loved you. She flinched. Isn't that the same? She asked. I shook my head. No, you miss being chosen without earning it. Her shoulders dropped. She said, I thought you'd fight for me. I answered, I did. You walked away anyway. She whispered, I didn't think it would hurt this much. I leaned back and said, pain doesn't ask permission. She wiped her eyes and said, do you hate me? I thought for a moment. No, I said, I outgrew that. She looked surprised. Then what do you feel? I said, closure. She leaned forward. Is there any chance? I met her eyes and said, no, her breath caught. Why not? She asked. I replied, because I survived without you. She started crying. I lost you, she said. I nodded. Yes. She asked, was I that easy to replace? I said, you weren't replaced. You were released. She covered her mouth. I didn't expect this, she said. I answered, neither did I. She said, I wanted you to save me. I replied gently, I already saved myself. She looked small then. I was wrong, she said. I nodded again. You were. She asked, do you forgive me? I said, I forgive myself for trusting you. That answer seemed to end the conversation. She sat back and stared at the table. I hope you're happy, she said. I stood and said, I'm learning. As I walked away, she called my name. I didn't turn around. Outside, I breathed deeply and said goodbye. I felt lighter. She lost someone who truly loved her. I gained myself. I heard about Daniel's fall before I saw it. Someone at work said, that guy you used to know is in trouble. I asked, what kind of trouble? They said, legal stuff. Debt. No one's standing with him. I nodded and replied, that happens. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt distance. That surprised me. I went back to my desk and said quietly, so this is karma. A week later, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. When I did, I heard his voice, thin and desperate. I need to see you, he said. I replied, why? He said, please. I paused, then said, one conversation. We met in a public place. He looked smaller than I remembered. He said, you look good. I replied, I feel stable. That word seemed to hurt him. He didn't waste time. I lost everything, he said. I asked, what do you want from me? He swallowed and said, "Forgiveness." I studied his face. "Why now?" I asked. He said, "Because I'm alone." I nodded. "That's honest." He leaned forward. "I made mistakes." I replied, "You made choices." He flinched. "I didn't think it would end like this," he said. I answered, "It always ends like this." He started talking fast. "She left. The baby's coming. I have no job. Everyone hates me." I said calmly, "None of that is my responsibility." He whispered, "I know." His hand shook. "I ruined my life," he said. I corrected him. "You traded it." He looked at me and said, "I miss us." I replied, "That version of us doesn't exist anymore." He said, "I was jealous." I raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" He answered, "Your loyalty. Your certainty." I nodded slowly. "You mistook that for weakness." He said, "I'm sorry." I waited. The silence stretched. He said, "Say something." I replied, "I already did a long time ago." He asked, "Can you help me?" I shook my head. "No." His face crumbled. "I thought you'd understand," he said. I answered, "I do understand. That's why I won't save you." He leaned back and stared at the ceiling. "So that's it?" he asked. I replied, "That's freedom." He looked confused. "For who?" he asked. I said, "For me." He laughed bitterly. "You're cold," he said. I replied, "I'm clear." He said, "Do you forgive me?" I took a breath. "Yes," I said quietly. His eyes widened. "Then why won't you help?" I answered, "Because forgiveness isn't reconciliation." He closed his eyes. "I deserve this," he said. I nodded. "You do." I stood up. He reached out. "Wait." I looked at him and said, "This is where we end." As I walked away, I felt calm. No anger. No triumph. Just balance. I didn't look back. Outside, I said, "I'm done carrying this." Daniel lost everything chasing what wasn't his. I lost nothing by letting go. That was the difference. I stood in my new apartment and said, "This is mine." The words felt steady. Laura leaned against the doorway and smiled. "You say that like you're convincing yourself," she said. I replied, "I am." She stepped inside and asked, "Does it feel different?" I nodded. "It feels quiet in a good way." She looked around and said, "You earned this." I answered, "I survived for this." We sat on the floor with coffee cups. Laura said, "You don't talk about your past much." I replied, "I don't need to anymore." She tilted her head. "Does it still hurt?" I thought for a moment and said, "It doesn't control me." She smiled softly. "That's better than healed." I agreed. Healing felt like pressure. This feels like choice. Later that night, I looked at old photos on my phone. I didn't delete them. I said, "You happened." That was enough. Laura watched me and asked, "Are you okay?" I said, "I am." She nodded. "I like how honest you are." I replied, "I promised myself I wouldn't lie again." She said, "Even to protect someone?" I answered, "Especially then." We talked about the future without rushing it. "I don't want promises yet," she said. I smiled. "Neither do I." She asked, "Then what do you want?" I said, "Consistency." She laughed lightly. I could do that. There was no fear in that moment, just calm. I realized love didn't need drama to feel real. The next morning, I woke up early and looked out the window. I said, "You're still here." My reflection looked back, older and steadier. I remember the nights I begged for answers. I whispered, "You didn't break." That mattered. When Laura joined me, she asked, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I used to think losing them ruined me." She waited. I continued, "It saved me." She touched my arm and said, "I'm glad you stayed." I replied, "So am I." We made breakfast together, nothing fancy. She joked, "You cook like you plan life." I laughed. "Carefully?" She said, "Intentionally." That word stayed with me. Intentional. That was who I was now. Later, Mark called. "Settled in?" he asked. I said, "Yeah." He replied, "Proud of you." I paused. "That means more than you know." He said, "Don't disappear." I answered, "I won't." After the call, I sat quietly and said, "People stayed." That was new. I walked through the empty rooms and felt no ghosts. Just space. I said, "This is where I start." I didn't need closure letters or final speeches. I already said everything by living well. Laura watched me and asked, "Ready?" I replied, "I've been ready." She smiled. "Then let's take it slow." I nodded. Slow feels strong. As the sun set, I stood alone for a moment. I said, I chose myself. No one argued. No one needed convincing. I felt peace settle in my chest. Losing them didn't make me smaller. It forced me to grow. True justice wasn't revenge. It was becoming someone they could never replace.